Welcome, everybody. Hello, and welcome to this final plenary session of the conference. It's a great pleasure and an honour to close the conference. This is the Simon Gaunt Memorial Lecture, and it's been a real pleasure to attend some of the medieval sessions at this conference and just be able to see and to attest to the incredible richness of medieval studies at the moment. And I hope that this whole event can stand as a fitting tribute to our colleague Simon Gaunt. But today I'd like to welcome our friend and colleague Richard Scholar, who for many years now has been making an immense contribution to our collective discipline in all its modalities. After many years in Oxford, Richard took up the chair in French at Durham in 2019, and throughout this all, there has been so much to admire. First of all, of course, the outstanding research profile, which is and has always been of international prominence. Richard was decorated by the French government as Chevalier d'Ordre des Palmes Académiques as early as 2008. So the research profile, but also the academic and strategic leadership. For example, as senior tutor at Oriel College, Oxford, and as deputy head of school at Durham. And here I cite only two prominent contributions in a career that has been distinguished by an interest, I think, in what it means to lead by example. It's a huge asset to Durham and to all of us who work on French in its earlier manifestations that we also now have Richard in the role of director of Durham's Institute of Medieval and Early Modern Studies. I perceive Richard as a great connector of people and of ideas. Richard works, as many of us in Renaissance and Early Modern Studies do, on the language-based study of culture and society, on the history of thought, but there's also an extremely powerful comparative dimension to his research, as he thinks across global French and world literature and connects all of these areas in his published research. Let me take as one example his third book, Émigré, French Words That Had Turned English, published with Princeton University Press in 2020, which brings early modern French sources into dialogue with more contemporary Francophone Caribbean thought. The concept of creolization, as articulated by intellectuals such as Édouard Glissant and Stuart Hall, is put in contact with the study of key words, as pioneered by Raymond Williams. In a quotation from the 17th century polymath John Evelyn at the start of chapter 1, we read that there is a manifest rotation and circling of words, which go in and out like the mode and fashion. And Richard traces out the choreography of the long history of English borrowing from French, all of our various galanterie, naïveté, ennui, and caprice, to examine what this says about the creolizing entanglement of societies and cultures. These words dance across languages in the case of galanterie, or loom in the spaces between them in the case of ennui. This is an experiment in a form of cosmopolitan criticism, writes Richard. These émigré words complete English as a language by elegantly recalling its fundamental incompleteness. They reveal its insistence on the languages that surround it and designate its constitutive problems, even as they mark out new possibilities. The cross-cultural inventiveness of Richard's thinking is equally in evidence in the next book in the pipeline, Utopiana, Inventions After More. This is under contract with Princeton University Press, and it's what we're going to hear about today. And this new project, I think, follows on coherently from Richard's previous work in traveling with language across marked boundaries, boundaries of political geography or of confessional allegiance or of genre, and relocating that language in new settings. So this project and the book are supported by the Leverhulme Major Research Fellowship that Richard currently holds. And it's wonderful that we are going to get a taste of these projects today then in Richard's talk entitled French Utopiana, Inventions After More. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma, very much. Just to check that everybody can hear me okay. Good, okay. So Thank you very much, Emma, for that extremely generous and thoughtful introduction. And I offer my thanks to the Society, to the organisers of this conference, Di, Nina and Kate, and to all of you who are here on this final morning of a terrific conference. I feared that the sheer energy of last night's ceilidh, as well as some of the fancy footwork, might have deterred more of you from coming along, but I'm really impressed that it hasn't. And I will try to offer some of the energy in the footwork this morning. This is going to be a talk about the making of worlds other than this crisis-beset world, and about the precious role that literature has to play in the process of imaginative, alternative world-making. It will also be about the changeability of those imagined worlds, about the material processes of translation and transformation that they undergo in their shape-shifting transit through history. And therefore, it's going to be about the languages in which they're made, including French, which has a unique role to play in that history. So to come right back to the opening remarks in this conference, Nina's, I really welcome the fact that we're meeting here at the University of Stirling, an institution whose commitment to languages remains as strong as ever at this difficult time. And as Emma says, this is also the first of the Society's annual lectures in memory of Simon Gaunt, which I'm very honoured to be asked to give. Many here will remember Simon as all of the things that Emma Campbell described in her moving 2022 French Studies obituary, as a widely respected scholar, an inspirational teacher, and an unfailingly supportive mentor and friend. I salute the Society's decision to honour Simon's memory and delighted to be a part of it. I'm no specialist of the Middle Ages, as Simon was, but I hope that my work on vernacular utopianism will seem an appropriate choice of topic. Simon's work on French outside the borders of France in the Middle Ages did so much to explore France's interactions and the interactions of French with other vernaculars. And I think that my work may be said in some ways to pursue the study of those interactions in the period that follows the Middle Ages. It's during this period that the act of imagining alternatives to the here and now starts to be called utopianism. This happens in the wake of Thomas More's Utopia, a fantasy of open-ended conversation about a Europe beset by crisis and about a far-flung island on which human life might be better organised. A work first published in Latin in 1516 and translated into many of the vernaculars of Europe in the course of the 16th century. What, though, precisely is utopianism, and how does it operate? And how does it relate to Thomas More's Utopia? Well, those are the questions at the heart of the book that, as Emma said, I'm currently preparing with the support of a Levy-Hume Major Research Fellowship. And these questions have a broad reach, obviously, across boundaries of time, geography, language, discipline, discourse, and theme. They're relevant to a contemporary world beset by a cost of living crisis, climate emergency, social and economic inequalities, and failures of political leadership, he says, in this week. They have their place then, if you like, in contemporary socio-political theory, economic thought, and also legal thought and eco-criticism, both of which have been discussed in the course of this conference. Now, my research touches on all of these themes and fields of inquiry, but it focuses on the vernacular European literatures of the early modern period, and in particular, the long century that follows the publication of More's Utopia. More's work is cited time and again in mainstream utopian studies as the point of origin for utopianism and as a principal source of its modern development. But as we'll see, my argument will be today that the contribution of More's Utopia to the development of utopianism can be properly understood only once one asks not just what the work conveys, thematically speaking, but by way of propositional content, but also how it communicates content to its readers and how they make sense of the work in their own situation. Those questions of form and reception transform the terms in which the question of propositional content is to be addressed, and they thus transform our understanding of utopianism. They bring in fields of inquiry that may seem to some remote from the concerns of socio-political theory, sociology, eco-criticism, fields that include the comparative study of modern languages and cultures, the histories of literature, learning, translation, transmission, and reception. My broader case is that work in these fields is and should be central to the study of utopianism. I take my cue for my remarks today from a sentence in one of Montaigne's essays in which he claims that the current way of life of the Amerindian cannibals of his essay's title surpasses all the inventions of the good collective life imagined by the European tradition. Il me semble que ce que nous voyons par expérience en ces nations-là surpasse non seulement toutes les peintures de quoi la poésie a embelli l'âge doré et toutes ses inventions à feindre une heureuse condition d'homme, mais encore la conception et le désir même de la philosophie. That is quite a sentence. I'm not going to follow, I'm going to come back to it later. I'm not going to address for now Montaigne's provocative claim in that sentence. I just simply want for now to observe that when Montaigne refers to attempts by European writers to imagine a happy community, he calls these attempts inventions. This is a term repeatedly used of the most famous and controversial attempts of the century, More's Utopia, already translated twice into French by the time Montaigne wrote Des Cannibales. Use of this language continues pretty much to this day. The American post-colonial feminist author Ursula K. Le Guin, in a 2016 essay published to mark 500 years of More's Utopia, uses the language of invention to describe her own novelistic exercises in ambiguous utopianism in the wake of More. So what might it add to our wider understanding of the utopianism that develops after More to see it as a process of invention? Well, my answer is going to come in a lecture in three parts. I'm going to start by pointing out some trends in the vast field of utopian studies on More's Utopia, and some of the core assumptions in that scholarship that I want to challenge. In the second part of the lecture, I'm going to offer invention as an alternative conceptual model for understanding utopia and its early transit across the literatures of the early modern world. That model reflects, I hope you'll see, the evolving and the many layered conceptualizations of early modern invention in and around More's Utopia. It's designed, if you like, to capture the extraordinary variety of inventions that utopia elicits in the long 16th century. These inventions are the Utopiana of my title. They're to be found in all of the languages and cultures that pick up on More's work in the period. And my book draws these into a comparative analysis, but this being the conference it is, in the third and final part of the lecture, I'm going to be focusing on French Utopiana by looking at three case studies that bear out the argument I'm trying to make. So let's get going on the first part, in which I'd like to single out a widely shared assumption in contemporary utopian studies about how utopianism is to be defined and how its historical development is to be understood with reference to More. That assumption connects the three faces of utopianism that the utopian scholar Lyman Tower Sargent has distinguished within the vast transdisciplinary field of utopian studies. These faces are literature, intentional communities, and socio-political theory. So my broader case here is that while each of these utopian fields operates according to its distinct disciplinary methods of inquiry, they share two assumptions: that utopia is to be defined as the expression in history of a core idea, an idea that finds its supreme modern articulation in More's Utopia and is then transferred to other historical instances. I'll mention very briefly two examples of highly important work, influential work done on the basis of these assumptions. The first of which is, it comes from the study of political thought in intellectual history. J.D. Davis's study of 16th and 17th century utopianism, Utopia and the Ideal Society, in which he defines utopia as an idea concerned with the form of the ideal society, or best state. All thinking, he says, about the ideal society must address what he calls the collective problem, namely the fact that there's never enough around to satisfy everyone all of the time. In other words, I'm quoting him, limited satisfaction exposed to unlimited wants. So what distinguishes utopia from other forms of ideal society, says Davis, is that it accepts the collective problem as it is. The utopian seeks to solve the collective problem collectively, that is, by the reorganization of society and its institutions, by education, by laws, and by sanctions. The second example I want to share with you comes from the study of utopia as an example of literary genre formation. This is Darko Suvin's essay defining the literary genre of utopia, published first in 1973 and then revised in 2006. Utopia, says Suvin, is the verbal construction of a particular quasi-human community where socio-political institutions, norms, and individual relationships are organized according to a more perfect principle than in the author's community. This construction being based on estrangement arising out of an alternative historical hypothesis. Well, there'll be lots to say about this definition, but I'll just point out that Suvin goes on to distinguish utopia in this sense from neighboring verbal artifacts, dystopias, anti-utopias, anti-utopias, and so on. All of these, he says, are, I'm quoting him, fictional strategies gelling into narrative genres, and they derive in historical terms from More's Utopia. So Davis's work in intellectual history, Suvin's literary study of genre formation, differ in their disciplinary methods and primary materials, yet they both assume that a core idea found in More's Utopia may be seen at work in other instances, and that this idea concerns the construction, whether that's a conceptual construction or a verbal one, of an alternative society and its institutions. These assumptions have generated really important insights, even as I think they offer a reductive account of both of More's Utopia and of the responses that that work elicits in its historical transit. So in what sense do I mean reductive? Well, they tend, first of all, to reduce the two books of More's Utopia to one, the second of the books, and to treat the description that it contains of an alternative society and its institutions in isolation from the dialogue that surrounds it. There's more to utopia than the verbal construction of a community and its socio-political institutions, which seeks to solve the collective problem collectively. That construction equates to the discourse, as I've just said, found in Utopia Book 2, in which it's voiced by a character in a conversation, the conversation which More's work reports to its reader. That character is a Portuguese traveller by the name of Raphael Hythloday. Thomas More doubles up as a second interlocutor in the conversation and its narrator, and he recounts how Raphael told More and his friend Peter Gillis one afternoon of an island on the margins of the known world from which he's recently returned. This island is called Utopia. It's home to a Venetian-style republic run by elected officials. And of all the commonwealths that he's visited many, Raphael declares Utopia to be the only one deserving of the name Commonwealth. Why? Because all things there are held in common. Gillis and More listen politely to Raphael's declamation in favour of utopian life, but More nonetheless voices his disagreement in the dialogue with the communistic socio-political institutions of the utopians and other customs of theirs. And the text ends without resolving this disagreement. Other arguments surround that discourse and that discussion. They concern, in the first book, the lamentable state of contemporary England and other European monarchies in the 16th century, at the present time, and the possibility or otherwise of political counsel, in other words, offering advice to the rulers of the world that they might actually listen to. Raphael denounces the rampant economic and social inequality in England, and he complains that land and money-grabbing princes all over Europe heed only the advice that suits them. All of these arguments, all of this propositional content, if you like, including the discourse on utopia, is debated in the form of an open-ended dialogue, as I've already indicated, and also presented in a serioludic narrative mode. A playful framing narrative establishes a realist fiction in which the ideal commonwealth of utopia appears as a place that exists in the real world that Raphael's visited and come home from. Yet that fiction, that framing, simultaneously finds ways of suggesting to the reader that its truth claims are not to be taken seriously. The names of places and people do much of this work upon the reader. The most visible of all of these self-mocking names is, of course, Utopia itself, whose Greek derivation reveals it to be a no place. But other places of which Raphael speaks have similarly revealing names, and that's true of people too. Raphael's very surname, Hythloday, betrays him to those with a Greek to spot it, or a modern critical edition to help them, as a peddler of nonsense. More's name, we know from Erasmus, in Latin, morus, means fool. Raphael's declamation, the peddler of nonsense's declamation in praise of utopia, suddenly looks ambivalent. One's left wondering whether it does indeed offer an exercise in designing better or best socio-political institutions, or whether in fact it illustrates the folly of all such abstract exercises in the real world. A third interpretive possibility is that it mixes the serious and the playful in one enigmatic whole. All of which is to say, I come to the bottom of my slide here, that the form and style of utopia complicate the propositional content of the work. The form and style, and the form and style of utopia feature just as much as its arguments do in early responses to the work. So to bring this section to an end, the price, I think, that Thomas More pays, 500 years on and counting, for his place at the centre of contemporary mainstream utopian studies is the very complex of features I've just described. Davis and Suvin have relatively little to say about these features, but their importance to More's work, I think, is demonstrated by the work's early reception. This is a work that's continually transferred to new situations and undergoes change after sea change as it's redeployed, either as a whole or in pieces, in its form and in its substance, and as its reusers respond to its substance and its style, or some combination of the two. So what's needed, I want to suggest, and this is the second part of my talk, is a conceptual model that follows utopia in this process of transfer I've talked about to new situations. So in what follows, I'm going to turn for such a conceptual model to the notion of invention, as it's understood by early modern learning and literature. The notion that More's utopia is or involves invention starts in the work of France's foremost humanist in the age of Thomas More, Guillaume Budet, who writes a preface to Utopia which is added to the work from 1517 onwards, so very early. What precisely does the language of invention, as he and his successors use it, what does it reveal of early utopianism? Well, what I'm going to suggest for the rest of this part of the lecture is that it reveals, above all, a volatile combination of two things that seem unusual, if you like, to a contemporary understanding of invention. The volatile combination of discovery and creation. Invention has been, in its 16th century conceptualization and uses, has been really well studied in a range of contexts by word historians such as Roland Green in 2013 and Graham Castor in 1964. Castor and Green both agree that invention in the 16th century is, if you like, caught up in a long and uneven process of change as it moves from its classical sense in rhetorical theory, where it means the discovery of some pre-existing material, to its modern technological sense, if you like, of the conception or creation of something new. And what goes along with that change too is a change from, if you like, the field of communal endeavor to that of more individual action. So for Roland Green, whom I've just mentioned, that process of change was underway by the time Moore was composing his text, but it was far from complete. So the invention functions in the 16th century as what Green calls a semantic palimpsest. It's a many-layered thing, held in tension. The tension, says Green, built into the word doesn't compromise its meaning, it is that meaning. And it's that tension, I think, between discovery and creation that helps to account for Utopia as a work that discovers the old Greek thinking about the best form of the state, even as it creates a new world that surpasses the old in its communistic approach to political and social life, its attack on rampant inequality, its promotion of justice for all. Meanwhile, in locating this world in a no place described by an unreliable narrator, the work presents the problems it discovers, as too serious always to be taken seriously. It plays discovery off against creation to implicate its arguments in their own satire and to generate from within its other. My study confirms the importance, I mentioned Boudet's paratext, his preface to the Utopia. My study confirms the importance of the work's many paratexts in the period, which were the focus of a 2008 study edited by Terence Cave. But what I tried to do is to bring into focus early responses to the work as a whole. And I think these responses matter because they help us to understand why the work became the object of such contrasting interpretations. As thinkers, writers, translators, artists, printers, readers use the work as what Cave calls an instrument for thinking with. Some of them were sensitive to the intellectual invention of the work, to its opposition to the criminalization of poverty, the profiteering of ruling elites across Europe. I don't know if any of that sounds familiar. And also, they were sensitive to the radical arguments that the work makes in favor of a society that holds all things in common. But others were sensitive to the work's formal properties of invention, its use of rhetorical figures, textual forms, and contrapuntal mode to complicate its communication of intellectual content. And others still responded to both the argumentative and formal invention of the work. So this is a varying picture, which records, if you like, the travelling history of a community whose members, a community of inventors, we might call them, whose members look back to More's Utopia in the act of inventing new and often contradictory directions for utopianism. The makeup of that community, as well as its forms of engagement with the utopian, are of interest to me, and my choice to privilege vernacular inventions in response to More's work brings into the centre of this community early modern women writers such as Moderata Fonte in Venice and Margaret Cavendish in Newcastle. These women are precursors, if you like, to Ursula K. Le Guin and the other major female utopian writers who have emerged in and since the 1970s. Yet the contributions of Fonte and Cavendish to the utopian tradition don't fit the political blueprints and literary conventions usually associated with the tradition. So, I want to make the case that they're better understood as working within a border-crossing early modern culture of divergent invention. A culture in which France has a unique role to play. And this brings me to my final part. I've mentioned already Guillaume Boudet as a major early reader of More's work in France, and his influence is felt across the 16th and 17th century translations and adaptations and imitations of More's work in France. I'm going to focus on three case studies today, but I want to set them in the broader context of early modern French Utopiana, among which some of them are, if you like, operate like large-scale imitations of More's work, using the discourse on utopia as a model. Others adapting the contrapuntal mode of the work to different scenarios, but also to be found a much smaller scale, almost sentence-level redeployments of More's work that signal a divergence or acknowledge a debt as they make something new. So what happens throughout this process is that utopia remains the site of continuing and often divergent French reinventions. These reinventions are often, although not always, related to the project of translating More's work into the French vernacular. Three French translations of versions of Utopia appear in the 16th century alone, and that's really extraordinary. It's an extraordinary number when you compare that with other languages and cultures of the same period. Translation of this work was a complex process in France, involving the full range of meanings that French in this period lends to the verb traduire. It involves transportation, appropriation, perhaps the trahir that we were hearing about yesterday from Kamel Daoud, and transformation. And translation itself is often seen in this period as a form of invention. A major protagonist in the French vernacular development of utopianism in the period, between Rabelais and Montaigne, who I'm going to come on to later, is Barthélemy Hanot. Hanot, I start with him because he's one of those exemplary figures who, in their own work, connect directly the vernacular translation of More's work to its wider history of literary and philosophical invention. Hanot was a leading figure in Lyon, in the humanist circles of Lyon in the middle of the 16th century. He took part in the title on your left, a 1559 revision of the very first vernacular French translation of More's Utopia, the one that had been produced in Paris by Jean Leblanc in 1550, which I listed on the previous slide. So that was 1559. The following year saw Hanot publish a fictional work of his own, to the right of the slide, A Lector, a work which bears the traces of his work on More's Utopia, published the previous year. What does Hanot do with More's Utopia? Well, in his 1559 edition, he revised the translation he got from Leblanc, and he provided it with a new preface and a new glossary of utopian names. I talked about utopian names earlier, and I'm going to come back to that. In both the preface and in the glossary, Hanot focuses in terms on More's invention, which he sees as bridging the arts of philosophical argumentation and literary persuasion. And I'll offer you just one key statement of his view from the preface that he writes to Utopia. Le magnifique Thomas More, très subtil ouvrier de ingénieusement inventé et de bien dire, sous fiction chorographique d'une île nouvellement trouvée et très civilement régie, a coloré l'image d'une très excellente police de République. So More, as a super subtle and witty inventor, ingenious inventor. What does Hanot mean by that? And what about this fiction chorographique? Well, the broader thing to say is that Hanot in this preface presents More as an heir to Plato. I mean, this is a very common thing in the period, and More invites this thought. But for Hanot, More is an heir to the Platonic tradition of both philosophy and poetry. philosophical poetry. And he's also an innovator. So Anno sees More's account of Utopia as his très excellente police de République, as a Platonic form. In other words, an archetype that governments in the real world strive to imitate, but which they always end up representing imperfectly. There's a kind of failure written into the whole thing. That's Plato the philosopher. Meanwhile, Anno finds in Plato the poet the key to understanding More's use of literary form in Utopia. But he goes on then to highlight a formal innovation that he says More has introduced. And this is what he calls fiction chorographique, and what we might call a realistic fiction of place. Anno argues that it's this fiction chorographique which causes us to view as a true story of New World travel what is in fact an imaginary and jokey account. Anno doesn't merely translate and comment on Utopia as a super subtle and witty invention. He reinvents utopian form and content in his own fiction. Alector, that work of prose fiction the following year, 1560, takes as its main setting a circular city, aptly named Orbe. As we've seen, Anno in his 1559 edition of Utopia coined the adjective chorographique to refer to More's precise description of a place, the island of Utopia. And what Anno does in Alector is he reuses that term, calling his description of the city of Orbe a chorographie. That's at the bottom of your right-hand side of your slide. This reuse of language suggests that Anno is merely transferring an element of form, chorography, from Utopia to Alector, but that transfer marks a profound divergence. For surrounding utopian chorography in the mix of Alector is a form that's nowhere present in More's work, namely a romance narrative. A narrative that starts when the hero of the story, Alector, is surprised in the bedroom of his beloved. He's brought to trial. The high priest of Orbe punishes Alector for his transgression by sentencing him to trial by fight with the enormous serpent that has long terrorized the city of Orbe. It's Alector's triumphant slaying of the serpent that follows directly the chorographical description of the city. The trial of Alector in this way produces an outcome that immediately satisfies all the demands of the narrative and that satisfies our hero and his accusers. This is, if you like, a realization in romance narrative of a point that's made chorographically by More. Raphael Hythloday describes Utopia as a community whose leaders swiftly settle legal disputes, where by marked contrast, legal wranglings constantly bedevil the life back in Europe. And Anno himself spells out this contrast in his edition of Utopia. This is a marginal note in his edition, where he notes at this point in the text of Utopia of the utopians that ils soudain mettent fin au procès, et aux autres pays on les allonge tout à gré. Well, we're all able to infer that these autres pays are meant to refer to countries much closer to home, to France, to its neighbours. So Anno is using the opportunity provided by More's Utopia to compare home unfavourably with far-flung alternative societies. And in this way, and in Alector, he's writing a new chapter in the history of utopian invention. So do the canonical French writers of the same century, Rabelais and Montaigne, both of whom produce Utopiana, which are routinely pushed to the margins of utopian studies because they don't fit the core definitions that those studies offer of utopia as a political or literary idea. Yet both of them realize the possibilities of utopian invention in their own fashion. And I'm going to say a little briefly now how. I'm going to, time being starting to become tight, I'm going to take you more quickly through my Rabelaisian case study. Rabelais directly alludes to More's Utopia. as a precursor of his own serioludic fictions. He's sensitive to More's crafty invention of an alternative world that invites comparison with the real world and that enacts the contrasting perspectives that the comparison produces. Like Moore, Rabelais makes this comparison, this interactive sense-making, a major focus of what the characters in his fiction do as they seek to make sense together of the alternative world they've witnessed. And it's through his enactment of these processes, he undertakes to engage his readers in a parallel exercise. In Pantagruel and in Gargantua, the first two books of the series, Rabelais directly alludes to More's fiction by making the giant heroes at the center of his chronicles governors of the realm of Utopia. And this is where I'm going to briefly add my contribution to the discussions of royalty that have characterized this conference at various points. Rabelais decides to make his utopia a monarchy, thus differentiating it from More's republic. And what that decision allows him to do is to dramatize situations common in the European monarchies and principalities of his age, in which the power of doing good and harm at home and abroad is concentrated in the hands of a single figure. What that allows him to do is then, so that when his giants then govern in the enlightened way that befits utopian princes, Rabelais' narrator is on hand to point out by contrast the errors and insufficiencies of contemporary European rulers in their attitudes to war and foreign conquest, and also in their management of domestic affairs and the education of their elites. And these take us through the first three of the episodes on your handout from Gargantua, Pantagruel, and also the Tiers Livre, the third book. A darker tone, once we get to the fourth book, a darker tone pervades as Rabelais brings to the fore the thought that utopia is no perfect archetype, but has socio-political failings of its own. This is a book in which Moore multiplies, in a way that Moore never does, multiplies utopian visions, placing, if you like, more or less utopian islands, more or less perfectly imagined islands in an archipelago which the travellers visit one after another, and some of which are distinctly ambiguous. Utopian literature didn't have to wait for Jonathan Swift or George Orwell to invent its unruly other. It's already there in Rabelais. So since time is against me, I won't linger with you on the final of those ambiguous utopias, the island of Gaster, which an island which looks from a safe distance like utopia, but then turns out to be governed by an endlessly inventive stomach, a stomach by the name of Gaster, fairly obviously. It's perhaps just enough to say very briefly, with the help of Jenny Oliver and also with the help of Terence Cave, that I see this episode as one in which Rabelais brings together the resources of utopia and invention to foreground the ambiguities of imaginative world-making that his fictions multiply. Okay, so that brings me to my final case study, Montaigne, who writes in the decades after Rabelais, Annaud, and others have established utopia as a recognizable feature in the landscape of French thought and writing. This may explain why he never directly alludes to More's work. Utopia is in the air, if you like, that Montaigne breathes. He reconsiders major themes also present in More's work, among them the question of whether or not the philosopher should risk the corruptions of politics by offering advice to a prince, and the questions of foreign policy that exercise Rabelais too. He contributes directly to the 16th century European debates about the best form of a state at a time when the continuing wars of religion in France and the controversy surrounding European colonization of the Americas shape his reflection. So Montaigne's imitation of More is adaptive then, as well as verbally indirect. I'm going to finish by circling back to the essay with which I started, Des Cannibales. This and other chapters of the essay offer no straightforward contribution to the political debate of the period, but a series of mental exercises or thought experiments conducted in the margins of political debate, their experimental character being reflected in Montaigne's choice of the word essay for his title. Montaigne essays the questions at the heart of Utopia. He weighs them up, he tries them out, and he engages his reader in that activity. Des Cannibales is written with a particular kind of reader in mind, and Lydie Mudelino talked a little bit about this kind of reader yesterday, a reader who sees the conquest of the Americas, and a European reader who sees the conquest of the Americas as a moment of progress in the history of humanity, which brought European civilization and the universal truth of their divinely revealed religion into the barbarous societies of the newly discovered continent. Such a reader, and what Montaigne's going to do is unsettle that reader's unthinking prejudices by setting out an alternative, by essaying the reader. Such a reader couldn't help but be provoked by the title of Montaigne's chapter alone. What, do these New World barbarians that feed on each other's flesh deserve to be the subject of a discourse? Well, that's exactly what Montaigne's going to suggest, and he offers, if you like, a declamation in praise of far-flung, naked, polygamous, man-eating human folly. And this is what indeed the chapter provides. Montaigne is writing about the Tupinamba people and their practice of ceremonially eating their prisoners of war. He judges it to be cruel, but less so than the atrocities of the Europeans who condemn them blind to their own faults. So the argument is comparative in its moral judgments and critical of the prejudices of common opinion. Montaigne suggests that the very people we, Europeans, unthinkingly despise for their so-called barbarity are actually living a life more perfect than any dreamt of by the entire tradition of European writing and thinking about the ideal society. This takes us right back to the sentence which I started with. So I pointed out Montaigne's decision to call the European tradition's attempts to imagine an ideal society inventions. What I didn't point out is that in doing so, Montaigne places that term inventions in a whole network of occurrences of that word in the chapter as a whole, which organizes, if you like, the progression of the argument. And Montaigne does this with other terms too, but what he does with invention is use it here to refer to European philosophical conceptions of an ideal society. Then the Tupinamba, who are closer to nature for Montaigne, are nonetheless also have their own society that's capable of its own inventions, and inventions that outstrip the European ones. Montaigne goes on in the chapter to offer detailed ethnographic information about the Tupinamba, their laws, their customs, and their cultural artifacts. He mentions, among other things, 2 songs that they sing, one of which he quotes in translation. We're back to translation. This is a song by a prisoner of war who knows he's going to be eaten by his captors. Montaigne quotes this in translation, then says of the song, and I'm quoting him, that it is an invention qui ne sent aucunement la barbarie. So, to the invention of European poetry and philosophy, Montaigne here adds, as a counterpoint, the invention of the Tupinamba. But that invention is also, finally, I want to suggest to you, Montaigne's. Montaigne has found the song, he's discovered, I'm returning to my initial account of what what invention means in this period. He's discovery as well as creation. He's found the song of the prisoner. He's transferred it and translated it in his chapter, and he's redeployed it in these altered circumstances, along with all the other evidence about the tupi number he's found. He bears the device of this invention by foregrounding it in the chapter. He talks, for example, about the role of translation and translators in mediating to him knowledge of the tupi number. He uses his invention to specify the kind of knowledge that enables meaningful socio-political and cultural comparison. And by this means, he essays the reader's unthinking prejudices. Okay, so I'm just going to conclude in a minute or two by saying that the French Utopiana of Rabelais, Montaigne, and Anu show, I hope, something of the diversity and depth of the inventions that characterize utopianism in the century after More. These inventions hardly figure in the mainstream understanding of utopianism in its early development, but I hope to have shown you why I think that understanding is incomplete without them. These inventions have relatively little to say directly and entirely seriously about what the form of what form the state ought to take, and they're not really searching or wanting to fit into the conventions of an emerging literary genre. They're messier than that. They're more richly various. They're more evasive. They are also more satirical about the very exercise of imagining the best form of a republic. Ursula Le Guin speaks for them, I think, when she describes 500 years later her own imaginative responses to the utopian tradition. And I'm going to leave my last words to her and to that essay, and to the essay she wrote, I referred to earlier, on the 500th anniversary of the first publication of More's Utopia. She's thinking about novels such as her novel The Dispossessed, and Always Coming, another of her utopian, title of The Dispossessed is An Ambiguous Utopia, okay, and a second and later novel, Always Coming Home. Most of my stories, I think, she says, are comedies of human manners, reminders of the infinite variety of ways in which we always come back to pretty much the same place, and celebrations of that infinite variety by the invention of still more alternatives and possibilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you so much for that rich presentation. We saw there not only the intrinsic interest of your own talk, but also some lovely connections with the other plenaries that we've seen at this session. And I hope that there will be some questions. We've got until 12:45 for questions from the audience. And as usual, there will be a microphone circulating. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you. Is it working? Yeah, okay. Thank you for this really interesting presentation. I wanted to ask you, so it really struck me that you said about More's that what some people didn't pay enough attention to was the actual form of the narrative and the fact that it was a dialogue, or that the dialogue was important there. And of course, I couldn't help thinking about that because so much of medieval texts are debates and dialogues. And I was wondering whether you thought that it's interesting that the three Del texts that you spoke about are not debates or dialogue from that, I know for sure that Montaigne, it's not the same type of dialogue, even though it might be a dialogue with the reader, right? So do you think that it's important that form has not been kept in the text that you spoke about? And does that say something about the evolution or the way that the 16th century French authors are kind of dealing with this type of topics?
So, yeah, I mean, I think that, thank you very much for that question. I mean, I think that what I wanted to suggest is that More's utopia is it uses dialogue, but in a textual mix of forms. There's a dialogue that's surrounded by a narrative, which itself has a further paratextual set of frames. And so what interested me above all is if you like, not so much that this work would be locatable as a dialogue, but that it is mobilizing the dialogic in its textual mix, in its formal mix. One of the things that strikes me, and you said so yourself as you were asking your question, I think, is that to point out that while Montaigne's essay are not formally speaking dialogues, they also mobilize the dialogic. The same is certainly also true of Rabelais' fictions, which contain actual dialogue. And I was trying to suggest also, I think, engage the reader in a kind of dialogue about the alternative worlds that they depict. So, this is a very broad and very varying set of responses. Some of them pick up on that formal aspect of More's work. Some of them pick up on others. Some of them entirely ignore those formal aspects and really reduce More's or offer, if you like, a kind of blueprint of how a society ought to be better organized. All of these responses are possible, but I'm all the time trying to be sensitive, alive to the formal question alongside the substantive ones.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard, for a really thought-provoking talk. So the thoughts that it provoked in me were in relation to invention, thinking about Mary Carruthers' work on invention and a term I'd like to introduce, which is inventory. The place that you go to discover the things that you need to create, the material that you are finding anew. And it seems to me that's quite useful to think about in relation to a text which is so playfully and as you so brilliantly put, so subversively thinking about what place is, if you're thinking about a non-place. And then I was also thinking about what the inventory might be for French responses to utopia, and if there's something specific about that. And obviously, what I'm going to propose or kind of ask you about is the Middle Ages as that inventory. I mean, is there a way in which the response to utopia gets inflected through medieval material? I mean, you kind of touched on some quite medieval-sounding romance-type narratives involving serpents, which we always love. But I was also thinking about travel and travelogues, for example, sort of the Marco Polo text that, of course, Simon Gaunt worked on. Thanks.
Gosh, that's loads of really brilliant thoughts there. Yes, I agree about the importance of inventory as a sort of way of collecting the bits of utopia that are then ready to be redeployed. I tend to think of that process of invention as not specific to France, but as a sort of an aspect of European learning. But I really like the idea that but you're absolutely right to point out the presence of forms that come to more from the Middle Ages. You mentioned the key ones. Rabelais is also, you mentioned Anno, but Rabelais is also obviously playing serioludically with with the forms of the chronicle, and he hasn't quite got a serpent, but he's got an enormous fish, which I'm sure, will fits the bill, the medieval bill. So it's a question of sort of some of the other forms that come into the mix. Moore proposes his Utopia as a sort of classic Renaissance work that misses out the Middle Ages and jumps straight back to Plato. But for all the reasons you've suggested, that's never a sufficient move. And the presence of that earlier material comes through in those responses. Also in Moore's in the Christian framing of his work. So, thank you.
Thank you. Just to complete the set, thank you, Richard. And yeah, with that last quote from Le Guin, you kind of had us thinking about conferences as utopias, right? Places we come back to that keep changing and yet are and are not the same place, which we've also just been talking about. I had a question which is kind of a version of Sophie's, so sorry if in the end I'm just repeating it, but I was very struck by both your formulation of the contrapuntal mode of the utopia and then this idea of Montaigne's text in particular, essaying the reader. So on the kind of maybe more the style than the form side of things, would we be able to make a case or recognize a utopian texture that goes beyond, or intersects with, but it doesn't always align with a kind of more explicit subject matter? So can texts operate utopianly? And I'm wondering about Le Guin in particular, but with the line that you trace through Cavendish as well, whether that's something that's going on here.
Yeah. So I think that the notion of texture is really not really helpful, and counterpoint is what I was trying to. What it would be my answer to your question. By a counterpoint, so again, I mean, that's it. There was enough to do in this lecture without taking you through conceptions of counterpoint in this period. But broadly speaking, whether we're talking about textile or music, what we're talking about in counterpoint in this period are two things that are introduced, put together, and held as a single entity, but in which the two things maintain their distinct identity and are played off against each other. So a theme introduced and then a counter theme, which throws the first theme into some sort of relief or question. This is a notion that's been really brilliantly reactivated by Edward Said in thinking about the ways in which post-colonial writing both echoes and plays itself off against dominant metropolitan narratives. And I think that that's what Moore is up to. He's giving us on the one hand he's playing us the tune of a better state, a better set of socio-political institutions, and introducing, with the other hand, a counterpoint which throws all of that into question, into relief, and asks us to think about what we really think is going on in the first theme. And I think that, to come back to some of my examples from earlier, you can see some of those French examples working contrapuntally in a similar way.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question at the front here. Thank you.
Is this working? Yeah, great. So thank you so much for the presentation. It was really interesting. So my question is more contemporary, actually. I don't know if that's cheeky with that.
No, go for it.
But
I'll do my best.
Yeah. So what I was thinking was, I'm really interested by this idea of invention. So there's been, since the 20th century, there's been a very, what I would call quite a reactionary critique of utopianism, which is that when utopia is understood as blueprint, then it can only lead to totalitarianism, because it imagines this perfect society, and then anyone who opposes it becomes a traitor. And that's where we see, for instance, the sort of critical utopia of someone like Le Guin, So I guess I was wondering how you would relate this idea of invention to, for instance, the work of someone like Ruth Levitas, who talks about utopia as method. Yeah, so that's the question.
I mean, I think that's a fantastically helpful question. I think my answer is that I would see myself as following in the wake of Ruth Levitas and also, as well as Ursula Le Guin, in trying to, I mean, what Le Guin says is that, so she comes at the end of this long tradition that I've been trying to argue with, which says that, you know, a utopia is a political blueprint, or for example. And she says, I just don't feel my work, my imagining of alternative worlds fits that description. The word has become too rigid. So there's a sense in which she's trying to dismantle the rigidity of that world while also keeping it. Hence ambiguous utopia in the subtitle of The Dispossessed. And I think that's what Ruth Levitas is doing with by if you like, undoing utopia as idea and making it a method. I guess my contribution is to suggest that invention helps to think about what that method consists of.
Okay, that's wonderful. I want to say thank you so much again to Richard. But since this is now the final minute of the conference, I also just want to take the opportunity also to say a huge, huge thanks to the organisers of the conference here in Stirling, and in particular, of course, to Kate Foster, who has been absolutely amazing. And this must have completely dominated your life, Kate, over the past few weeks and months. We really appreciate it. It's been a huge success. So again, I invite you to say thank you very much to our plenary speaker, Richard, but also to Kate and the organisers at Stirling. Thank you.